In the future, it's illegal for rich people to run. This guy is jogging along when it suddenly hits him. He stops dead in his tracks, because if he kept going, his secret of overnight wealth might be exposed. To shake off that unmistakable stench of poverty he was born with, he walks straight into a 7-star hotel and doesn't hesitate to book the presidential suite. But here's the strange part, the front desk doesn't charge him a dime. They just scan his wrist with a device and hand him a room key. See, in this future world, money no longer exists. Instead, people trade in time. Everyone has a timer embedded in their arm. It's both their currency and a countdown to death. The moment that timer hits 0, you drop dead on the spot. But if you've got enough time, you can live forever. Just 3 days ago, Will was flat broke. Every month, he slaved away like a machine on an assembly line at an electronics factory. And the time he earned? Barely enough to keep him alive till the next day. On top of that, the company constantly skimmed his overtime pay. Will was furious inside, but he didn't dare speak up, because if he got fired, he wouldn't even have enough time to find another job. Then one night, Will met a middle-aged man at a bar, and that's when everything changed. The man's arm displayed a full 100 years, but he was way too flashy about it, and it didn't take long for the wrong people to notice. Will stepped up to warn him, but the rich man couldn't care less. Right then, a gang of time robbers got word and stormed the bar. The crowd scattered in a panic, everyone scrambling to get out of the way. Faced with the threat, the rich man stayed eerily calm. He even said he needed to use the bathroom first, right there, at death's door. But what nobody expected was Will bursting out from the shadows, taking down the guard, and dragging the rich man to safety. The two sprinted through the streets, nearly getting caught several times, until they finally made it to an abandoned building and shook off the robbers. Seeing the rich man still able to crack a smile, Will couldn't help but ask, why would he come to the slums flashing all that time? The rich man explained that his beloved wife had recently passed away, and his total assets? Converted to time, they amounted to thousands of years. The thought of living forever in loneliness was more than he could bear, so he'd come to the ghetto to end it all. Will felt genuine sympathy, but he also learned a brutal truth from the rich man. 90% of the world's time is controlled by the wealthy. They manipulate prices in the slums, crush workers' wages, and jack up the cost of living, making sure the poor can never afford to stop and rest. That way, the rich get to enjoy eternal life and a luxurious existence. Then the rich man asked Will, if you had as much time as me, what would you do? Will rolled up his sleeve, looked at the pitiful amount left on his arm, and said he wouldn't waste a single second. Maybe it was the realization that he'd been squandering something others would kill for. The rich man just gazed at Will in silence and said nothing. The next morning, Will woke up and checked his timer out of habit, only to find 100 years had been added. The rich man was gone. He got up and walked to the window. There, sitting on the edge of the bridge, was the rich man. He'd given all his time to Will and was quietly waiting for his countdown to end. Then his heart stopped, and he fell into the river below. By the time Will got there, all he found was the body. But what he never could have imagined was that an inconspicuous security camera overhead was about to bring him a world of trouble. That evening, Will showed up with flowers, wanting to surprise his mother. He waited for her bus to arrive, but when it pulled in, she wasn't on it. A wave of dread hit him. He took off running toward her workplace. It turned out that when his mother boarded the bus, the fare had suddenly jumped from 1 hour to 2. After paying her mortgage, she only had an hour and a half left. Even walking home would take 2 hours. She was essentially trapped in a death sentence. His mother begged the driver to let it slide. Her son could pay the difference when she arrived. But company policy was strict. No credit, no exceptions. The driver's hands were tied, and not a single passenger offered to help. So she got off the bus to try the bank for a loan. But the bank had already closed for the day. With no other choice, she started running. After what felt like an eternity, mother and son finally spotted each other, both sprinting toward one another. But by then, she had only 10 seconds left. Their eyes locked with sheer desperation. They pushed themselves to the absolute limit, running as fast as their bodies would allow. Will reached out his hand, desperate to save her, but he was 1 second too late. Just like that, the joy of his newfound fortune vanished in an instant, replaced by nothing but grief and rage. He blamed it all on the rules the rich had written, and he swore he would take everything from them. The next day, after giving his best friend 10 years, Will set out for the wealthy district. But before he even got in, he was stunned. Just passing through 3 checkpoints cost him 2 full years. That alone showed just how impossible it was for the poor to break through the class barrier. Will's plan for revenge was simple: win their time from them. He walked into the biggest casino in the rich district and started small. After a few hands, his bankroll had grown to 250 years, enough to earn him an invitation to the high-stakes table. And there, he ran right into the wealthiest banker in the district. The man's pocket change alone was 9,000 years. The banker could tell Will wasn't from around here and decided to mess with him. Right off the bat, he shoved his chips forward. 50 years, a clear provocation. But Will wasn't about to back down. A flash of steel crossed his eyes, and he matched the bet without flinching. The banker's daughter noticed her father had met his match and came down to watch. Sensing her attention, the banker's competitive fire surged. Without a second thought, he raised by 2 centuries, trying to scare Will off, but Will had already made peace with death. His eyes burned with resolve as he went all in. betting his life. He left himself just enough time to flip the cards. The sheer madness of it stunned both father and daughter, and by some miracle, Will won. His bankroll skyrocketed to over 1,000 years. The banker admired Will's nerve. He introduced his daughter, Sylvia, and even invited him to a party at his estate. Will saw it as the perfect chance to dig deeper into the wealthy district, to uncover the secrets of the time system for his revenge, while blending in and gaining access. As he talked with Sylvia, he could tell she was drawn to him, and something about her, that effortless elegance of the upper class, stirred something in him too. Gradually, the comfortable life began to pull him in. Before he knew it, thoughts of revenge started to fade, and eventually, he pushed them out of his mind entirely. He walked into a luxury car dealership, dropped 60 years on a supercar, and drove to the banker's oceanfront mansion. The banker warmly introduced his family, his mother-in-law, his wife, and his daughter. Then, with the banker playing matchmaker, Sylvia and Will danced together in the middle of the living room. They hit it off instantly, talking for hours, and even ended up swimming in the ocean together. Sylvia thought Will was unlike anyone she'd ever met. Her feelings for him only grew stronger. But just then, the time police showed up. Without a word of explanation, they dragged Will upstairs for interrogation. They'd found the rich man's body under the bridge. Based on the surveillance footage, Will was a prime suspect. They traced his checkpoint records, pulled surveillance from across the entire wealthy district, and tracked his every move. When they saw the 1,000 years on his arm, they were even more convinced. He'd murdered the rich man and stolen his time. Will tried to explain that the man had given it willingly, and that he'd won the rest at the casino. But the lead officer refused to believe him, simply because he was a lowly poor man. They stripped every last second from his arm, leaving him just 2 hours for questioning. Will fired back. "People get murdered in the ghetto every single day. Why don't you do anything about that?" The officer's answer? "The lives of the poor are none of my concern." Just then, Sylvia caught his eye with a look. Will understood immediately. In a flash, he caught the two guards off balance, knocked them both down, ran downstairs, grabbed Sylvia as a hostage, jumped into his car, and tore out of there. To play it safe, Will headed back to the ghetto. He'd escaped the police, but he only had 1 hour left. Before he could even think of a plan, they ran into the time robbers on the road. They'd laid out spike strips that shredded his tires, sending the car flying out of control. Seeing them both unconscious, the robbers could barely contain their excitement. They were about to score 100 years off a rich man, except Will only had a few minutes left. Luckily, Sylvia still had 10 years. The lead robber immediately drained it into himself, leaving her with just 32 minutes. Between the two of them, they now had barely half an hour. That's when Will remembered his friend, the one he'd given 10 years to. Surely he could get a little back in an emergency. But it turned out his friend had blown 9 of those years on booze and partying, and drank himself to death. At least Sylvia's earrings were worth something. They rushed to a pawn shop. The earrings were worth 10 years, but the owner saw how little time they had left and lowballed them, offering just 2 days. Still, it bought them their lives. At least they had a day to figure things out. That's when Will spotted a billboard nearby, and an idea hit him. It had the banker's name on it. His daughter was in Will's hands. All he had to do was demand a ransom. He called right away.
"Hello, Will. How much do you want?"
1,000 years.
But when the banker heard the price, 1,000 years, he flat out refused and immediately locked down the bank. Sylvia was livid. Her own father didn't think she was worth 1,000 years, and to him, that amount was pocket change. Now they had barely a dozen hours left. Will couldn't stand the thought of Sylvia dying because of him. He told her to call her father and have someone pick her up. He'd figure something out on his own. Just in case, he handed her a gun for protection. What he didn't realize was that the police had already caught up. He'd been so focused on protecting Sylvia that he never noticed. At the last possible second, Sylvia spotted the officer and pulled the trigger. They were desperate for time, and someone had just delivered himself to their doorstep. But the officer barely had any time on him either. Standard protocol to prevent robbers from scoring big if they took down a cop. If he needed more, he could request a transfer from headquarters anytime. Will wasn't about to kill the man, though. He left him with 4 hours and change. In the end, they only gained 2 more days. If they wanted to survive, they needed a lot more time. So they turned to robbery. They pulled over a car that looked expensive. Since Will was driving a police cruiser, the driver assumed he was a cop, until he realized it was a holdup. The man panicked but refused to cooperate.
Whoa!
It went off. I was just trying to help.
So they took the time from the wealthy woman in the back seat, leaving her with just 1 day. Will even took her earrings. Then he turned around and gave them to Sylvia. Just like that, they became wanted criminals. Sylvia never imagined that a girl like her, born into privilege, would one day be on a police wanted list. But honestly, she found it kind of thrilling. She'd spent her whole life in the wealthy district, everything handed to her on a silver platter. She'd never experienced anything like this, so Will started teaching her how to shoot.
Well, if you got a lot of time, are you really gonna give it away?
I've only ever had a day. How much do you need? How can you live with yourself watching people die right next to you?
Sylvia told him, if he ever got his hands on a massive amount of time, She'd help him get even more to save the poor. The next day, they targeted a small bank. They drove a truck straight through the front entrance, loaded the time machines into crates, and handed the extras to the poor people inside who'd come looking for loans.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to announce that Weiss Time Lenders is now offering interest-free loans with no payments.
The moment people heard, they rushed in to grab what they could. The bank was cleaned out in minutes. Time capsules scattered all over the floor. The police arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. The time Will and Sylvia took, they distributed to the poor. One old man thought he was being robbed, until an endless stream of time started flowing into his arm. Word spread fast. People lined up at the bank to collect their share. The entire district's currency flow was thrown into chaos. With enough time on their hands, people could finally afford to buy guns for protection. No more living in fear of robbers. The robbers were furious. Will and Sylvia had destroyed their entire operation, so they started hunting them down. After the bank job, the two decided to treat themselves. They booked an entire hotel. The whole thing. The front desk was speechless. Nobody had ever rented out an entire hotel before. But when they saw over 1,400 years on Will's arm, they knew they were dealing with a VIP. Will figured robbing small banks wasn't going to cut it. To truly change the lives of the poor, he'd need at least 1,000,000 years. Sylvia didn't hesitate. She suggested robbing her own father. Since he wouldn't pay the ransom, he had no right to expect loyalty. The next day, she walked in pretending to surrender. Meanwhile, Will slipped in among the bodyguards and grabbed the banker. Talk about family values. They marched the banker to his office and cracked open the vault. Inside, exactly 1,000,000 years. Will stared at the number, a 1 followed by a wall of zeros. Completely stunned. That was enough for 1,000,000 poor people to each live 100 years. And all of it belonged to one man.
Flooding the wrong zone with 1,000,000 years. It could cripple the system.
The banker warned that breaking this balance would plunge the world into chaos. Everyone would want to live forever. It could even spark wars. The only way for a few to live forever was to sacrifice the many. That sent Will over the edge. His mother was one of those sacrifices. Were the lives of the poor worth nothing? He said no one should defy the natural order to achieve immortality. And with that, they walked out and distributed every last one of those 1,000,000 years. In an instant, the entire time zone descended into chaos. Banks could no longer keep the poor in check. Seeing the impact, Will and Sylvia knew their efforts hadn't been in vain. But it still wasn't enough. 1,000,000 years could change one district. To change the entire world, they'd need far more. Just as they were planning their next move, the robbers burst in and pinned them down. They could have killed them right there, but the gang leader wanted to play a game. An arm wrestle to decide who lives and who dies. Will saw his chance and accepted. The robber came in hard, slamming Will's arm down. Time started draining from Will's body instantly, but Will didn't look worried at all. As the robber's own countdown crept toward 0, he thought he had it in the bag. He started watching Will's arm, savoring the moment. And in that split second of distraction, Will surged back, flipping the robber's arm down. No matter how hard the man pushed, he couldn't reverse it. All he could do was watch his own time bleed away. Will had been playing him the whole time. Seeing their boss about to die, the other robbers finally snapped. They moved to take Will out, but Will whipped a gun from his ankle holster and dropped 3 of them before they could blink. The gang leader, stunned and defeated, could only sit there and wait for the end. By the time the police arrived, all they found were 4 bodies. The lead officer was seething. These two had torn his jurisdiction apart. He launched a full-scale pursuit. Checking his arm, he saw he only had 40 minutes left. He radioed dispatch to send his daily time allotment, but then he spotted Will and Sylvia fleeing, and had to abandon the transfer to give chase. He ordered the other officers to set up a blockade ahead. The moment the car passed, open fire. But the car was the banker's, fully armored. Regular bullets couldn't even scratch it. Will plowed straight through the barricade, right under the cops' noses. But just as they were about to reach the ghetto, Officer Raymond came out of nowhere, slamming his car into theirs and bringing them to a dead stop. Will jumped out and shoved the 1,000,000-year capsule into the hands of a little girl, telling her to share it with everyone. But his own time was almost gone. Raymond stepped out too. He had a gun. But this was the poor people's turf. The crowd erupted into chaos as everyone scrambled for the time. Will and Sylvia slipped away in the confusion. But Raymond wasn't giving up. He hijacked a car and took off after them. He caught up on a desolate road.
You can run.
So do you. You're from here, aren't you?
He knew these streets like the back of his hand. Raymond even admitted it. He was born here. Once upon a time, he'd wanted to change things too, just like Will, but he'd failed. Reality crushed him, and the only way to survive was to become their guard dog, keeping the time system in order. Will didn't say much. He slowly raised his arm and said, "You don't need to bother. I'm about to die anyway." Raymond looked. Then something clicked. He glanced at his own arm. 5 seconds. He'd been so focused on the chase that he never noticed his own time running out. The countdown hit 0. He collapsed on the spot. Will and Sylvia had no time to celebrate. They only had seconds left themselves. The nearest bank was 2 minutes away. There wasn't enough time, unless one of them gave everything to the other. But neither was willing to let the other die. Just as they were about to accept their fate, Will noticed Raymond's police car, the time transfer from dispatch. It was still in there. They sprinted toward it. Will pushed himself to the absolute limit and made it just before his countdown began. He grabbed a few minutes, then jumped out and ran back toward Sylvia. Her countdown had already started. They both stretched out their hands and ran toward each other with everything they had. This time, fate was on their side. It didn't end the way it had with Will's mother. They made it. They survived.